What happens when a duchess meets one of television's most ruthless interviewers? What was meant to be a lighthearted discussion about charity and purpose quickly devolves into a public clash that left millions speechless. How Meghan Markle walked into the real-time studio and was escorted out moments later. Two public figures, two powerful personalities, one stage. As tensions rose, so did the stakes, and neither was willing to back down. What began as conversation became confrontation, and what began as civility became chaos. Let's dive in. The stage was set for another Friday night taping of Real Time with Bill Maher. The studio buzzed with excitement. Fans settled into their seats, the overhead lights glowed softly, and producers gave last-minute cues into their earpieces. Bill, as always, stood just off stage, arms crossed, grinning like a cat who already saw the mouse coming. The guest list that night was ambitious. A policy wonk, a conservative columnist, and closing out the evening, Meghan Markle herself. Booked to discuss her ongoing advocacy work, a new podcast series, and her thoughts on social media culture, the Duchess of Sussex seemed poised and serene backstage. She wore an elegant black pantsuit, accented with gold jewelry and a soft wave in her hair. Her smile in the mirror was perfect, polished. At exactly 8 o'clock, the cameras rolled. The opening monologue finished, laughs came on cue, and Bill leaned into the camera. "And now," he said, "please welcome Meghan Markle." The audience erupted into applause as Meghan emerged, all grace and poise, her practiced smile in place. She waved demurely and shook Bill's hand before seating herself across from him at his iconic desk. "Meghan," Bill began warmly, "it's really something to have royalty here in the studio. Tell me, how's life outside the castle?" She chuckled softly. "Well, Bill, I wouldn't exactly call it a castle, but life is busy, purposeful." Bill smirked faintly but moved on. "So let's talk about that purpose. You've left the UK, you've left the royal family, but you're still in the headlines more than ever. Netflix, Spotify, interviews, books. Do you miss palace life, or is this the life you've always wanted?" Her smile stiffened just slightly. "I think it's important to move forward," she replied coolly. "Harry and I have chosen to focus on meaningful work rather than titles." "Sure," Bill nodded, his grin tightening. "But there's quite a difference between giving up titles and stepping into Hollywood contracts. Do you think you traded one spotlight for another?" There was a pause, just a beat too long, before Meghan replied, her tone sweet but sharp. "I think people are entitled to define their lives how they see fit, Bill. Not everyone is satisfied playing by old rules." Bill chuckled faintly. The audience picked up on the tension, sensing that this wouldn't be another scripted vanilla interview. Still, the conversation rolled forward. For now. Bill congratulated her on her charity work and her podcast. Meghan responded in kind, praising authentic dialogue and using your platform for good. But each of Bill's questions began to drift closer to a minefield. "You know," he said, resting his chin on his hand, "a lot of people still wonder, did you really think you could marry into the royal family, change thousands of years of tradition, and not ruffle some feathers? Or was ruffling feathers kind of the point?" This time, Meghan's practiced smile faltered completely. "I didn't marry Harry to ruffle feathers, Bill. I married him because I love him. I think that's something even you can understand." The studio audience chuckled nervously. Bill grinned faintly but pressed on. "And yet," he continued, "here you are, out of the family but still very much in the headlines. Is that really love, or is it branding?" Her cheeks flushed slightly. She tilted her head, fixing him with a look of royal disapproval. "That's a remarkably cynical way to view marriage. But then again," she added with a faint smirk, "I suppose cynicism is your brand." The audience gasped softly, sensing the temperature of the room rising. Bill's smile froze for the first time all night, and with that exchange, the opening cracks of civility gave way to the first tremors of what would become the most infamous interview of his career. The smiles are gone. The crowd is silent. Every question is a jab, and every answer a counterpunch. What started as conversation is now combat, and the gloves are coming off. Bill leaned back in his chair, hands clasped together, his eyes glinting as though he'd just spotted an opening. So Meghan, he said, drawing out her name deliberately, since we're talking about love and choices, let me ask you this. When you left the royal family, did you ever stop to think how that might feel to, the family, the Queen, William, Charles? Or was it just all about you? The audience winced at the bluntness. Even the cameras seemed to hesitate, zooming closer to Meghan, whose eyes narrowed slightly. Family is complicated, she replied, her tone clipped but still controlled. And sometimes you have to make choices to protect your own mental health and well-being. I don't expect everyone to understand that, but I do expect respect for that decision. Bill smirked faintly. Sure, mental health. Very popular these days, but you can see how it looks, right? You left the family, trashed them on television, signed a Netflix deal, and now, here you are telling your side. That's not just protecting your health, that's managing your image. Which fine, but don't pretend it's just some noble crusade. There were audible murmurs from the audience now, some gasps, a few stifled laughs. Meghan crossed her legs and leaned forward slightly. I think it's telling, Bill, that you reduce what I've been through to a crusade or term image management. You don't seem to grasp the human cost of the choices I had to make. Oh, I grasp it, he countered quickly. But you seem to think the human cost was only paid by you. What about Harry's family? What about the British people? Do you think it was fair to paint them all as villains in your little Hollywood saga? Meghan's nostrils flared as her practiced calm started to fracture. I don't think being honest about my experience makes me responsible for other people's guilt or discomfort, she shot back. Bill nodded thoughtfully, then added, so you don't take any responsibility at all for how messy things got? Her lips pressed into a thin line. I take responsibility for choosing myself, for choosing my family, for refusing to stay in an environment that was toxic. That's what I take responsibility for. The audience gave a polite smattering of applause. But Bill wasn't done. He leaned forward now, his elbows resting on the desk. All right then, let's talk about Harry. What would you say to people who believe that you pulled him away from his family? That you isolated him? That you, how do they put it, took him hostage? Meghan's eyes widened briefly in disbelief before narrowing. I would say those people clearly don't understand Harry at all. He's his own man and he made his own choices. Suggesting otherwise is not only sexist, but also insulting to him. Bill smirked. Ugh, sexist. There it is. Her jaw tightened. Yes, Bill, sexist. You don't get to frame me as some sort of manipulative woman who dragged him out of a castle because you can't imagine a man making decisions for himself. The crowd clapped louder this time, but Bill simply raised his eyebrow, waiting for the noise to die down. Fair enough, he said at last. But if we're playing the honesty game, let me ask, do you really think it's possible to walk away from the monarchy and cash in on it at the same time? Or is that just hypocritical? Meghan actually let out a sharp laugh, though there was no humor in it. You're really obsessed with this idea that my life is just one big transaction, aren't you? Bill tilted his head and delivered his next line like a blade. I'm just saying, if it quacks like a duck, Duchess. The crowd gasped audibly. Meghan froze, then flashed a smile so cold it could have frosted the camera lens. And I suppose you'd know all about ducks, Bill. You certainly quack enough. The audience erupted, half in shock, half in cheers, but the tension was electric now. Bill's smirk faltered for a moment before returning in full force. He leaned back in his chair, visibly enjoying the discomfort crackling in the room. Oh, we're just getting started, he murmured, his voice low but carrying through the room. And they were. By now the crowd was split, some visibly rooting for Meghan, others clearly on Bill's side, but everyone leaning in, unable to look away. He asked about royalty. She deflected. He pressed harder. She snapped. Now he's going after her career and there's no script that can save her. When the spotlight turns brutal, only one of them will walk away with dignity intact. Bill Maher glanced at his cue cards, then tossed them aside with a casual flick of his wrist. All right, Meghan, let's pivot, he said, stretching the tension in the room like a bowstring. We've talked about royalty, duty, and drama, but let's rewind to before you were Her Royal Highness. Megan's posture straightened slightly. If we must. Oh, we must, Bill replied with a grin. So suits acting, the glamorous world of television. Some folks argue that you were never really a great actress, that your fame exploded not because of your roles, but because of who you married. How do you respond to that? The studio held its breath. The question hit like a slap. Megan's eyes darkened. I respond by pointing out that I worked hard for over a decade in an industry that isn't exactly friendly to women of color. I earned every role I got. I climbed from the bottom, briefcases on Deal or No Deal, to series regular on a successful show. Bill tilted his head. Sure, and Suits was cute, but let's be honest, it wasn't The Crown. She scoffed. Are you seriously comparing a fictional legal drama to a period piece about your favorite outdated institution? Laughter rippled through the audience, but Bill's smile didn't waver. Touché. But the point is, you became globally famous not because of your IMDb credits, but because you married into Buckingham Palace, and then immediately acted like you didn't expect the attention that came with it. Meghan crossed her arms. You keep implying that I chased fame through marriage, but maybe I just fell in love with someone and didn't expect the world to turn me into a tabloid villain overnight. Bill shrugged. Okay, fair. But then riddle me this. Why haven't you acted since? If you loved it so much, where's the follow-up role? Where's the Oscar-worthy comeback? Or are you just too busy cashing Spotify checks? That one stung. Megan's jaw clenched visibly. You don't get to dictate what success looks like for me, Bill. Maybe I didn't want to go back to an industry that constantly judged me for how I looked, sounded, or who I married. He leaned forward. Or maybe the roles just weren't being offered. Maybe the offers dried up because, let's face it, Hollywood's not known for rewarding mediocrity twice. The silence was deafening. Meghan inhaled sharply through her nose. You know what I think? She said, her voice icy. I think you're just bitter that women like me, women who speak up, still refuse to play nice for men like you. You want a quiet, smiling duchess with no opinions. Well, tough. Oh, please, Bill replied, waving a hand. Don't flatter yourself. I love opinionated women. What I don't love is narcissistic revisionism. You came onto the show with talking points, a strategy, and a persecution complex. And you've been dodging basic accountability ever since. Accountability? Meghan's voice cracked into a sharp scoff. You think this is accountability? A middle-aged man with a smug smirk telling a woman she should be grateful for being abused by the press, sidelined by her in-laws, and mocked for sharing her pain? I think it's a conversation, Bill countered coolly, and you're turning it into a tantrum. There was a low murmur in the audience, shock, discomfort, and a few gasps. I'm not throwing a tantrum, Meghan snapped. I'm standing up to condescension disguised as cleverness. Bill's grin widened. I'm not condescending, Meghan. I'm just not buying the Netflix version of events. She leaned forward now, hands planted on her knees. Then maybe you should stop pretending to be a comedian and admit what you really are. A bully with a monologue. The words sliced the air, and then Bill's smile finally faltered, only for a beat. But it was long enough for the crowd to notice. The tension in the studio was volcanic now. He leaned back in his chair, tapped his pen twice on the desk, then nodded slowly. You know, he said, his voice lower now, more deliberate. This was supposed to be a civil conversation. You could have said your piece, promoted your charity, defended your story, but you've been combative since the moment the lights came on. Because your questions weren't questions, Meghan shot back. They were insults with punctuation. And your answers, Bill countered, have been narcissism with a side of victimhood. A pause. Then he stood. The studio gasped. Enough, Bill said flatly. I've hosted this show for over 20 years. I've interviewed presidents, dictators, comedians, actors, philosophers, and I've never asked a guest to leave. Meghan's eyes narrowed. But I'm making an exception tonight, Bill said, turning to the crew. We're done here. Gasps turned to stunned silence. You're kicking me out? Meghan asked, her voice cold with disbelief. Bill looked directly at the camera. To our viewers, I apologize. We'll return after the break with a real conversation. This isn't it. One host stood his ground, one guest refused to back down. And now, with millions watching, the final act begins. What happens when civility ends and the cameras keep rolling? This isn't just television anymore. It's a reckoning. The silence in the studio was electric. The cameras were still rolling. Meghan Markle stood rigidly, her hands balled into fists at her sides. Bill Maher remained standing as well, his arms loosely crossed, his expression grim but controlled. "You're kicking me out?" Meghan repeated, her voice thick with disbelief but also simmering with rage. "Because I refuse to smile through your disrespect?" Bill shook his head slowly. "No, Meghan, I'm asking you to leave because you've made it clear you're not interested in a conversation. You came here for a monologue, and that's not what this show is." Gasps rippled through the audience, and a couple of nervous chuckles escaped from the back rows, quickly dying away in the tension. Meghan let out a sharp laugh, but there was no humor in it. "You really think you can frame this as me being the problem, don't you? Classic. A man invites a woman onto his platform just to tear her apart and then claims she's the one who can't handle it." "I didn't tear you apart," Bill countered, his tone even but harder now. "I asked questions. Questions the public has been asking for years. About the monarchy, about your choices, about your career. And every single time, instead of answering, you lashed out." Meghan took a step closer to the desk, her voice rising. "Oh, don't you dare lecture me about lashing out, Bill. Your entire career is built on making people feel small, on twisting their words into punchlines, and now you want to stand there and pretend you're some kind of noble truth teller?" Bill leaned slightly toward her, his hands flat on the desk now. "I am a truth teller, and sometimes the truth hurts. You want everyone to believe you're a victim of circumstance, Meghan. But maybe you're just a victim of your own decisions." That was it. The line hung in the air like a thunderclap. Meghan's face flushed deep red. "You arrogant, smug, sanctimonious." She caught herself, then straightened, her chin lifted high. "You don't deserve my words." She turned sharply toward the audience, her heels clicking like gunshots on the stage floor. But she wasn't finished. Not yet. "You all see this, right?" she called to the studio crowd, her voice sharp and unwavering. "This is what happens when a woman refuses to sit quietly and let herself be demeaned. They call it losing composure. They say she's difficult. They tell her to leave." Bill raised his hand to interrupt, but she cut him off without even glancing at him. "No, Bill, you don't get the last word this time. You don't get to spin this into some triumphant moment where you expose the big bad Duchess. You expose yourself." Her eyes locked with his for a beat longer, then she yanked off her mic pack and dropped it on the desk with a sharp clack. "You're welcome," she said simply. Then she turned and walked off the stage, her back straight, her every movement deliberate and defiant. The audience was dead silent. The only sound was her heels fading as she disappeared into the wings. For a long moment, Bill just stood there, his hands on the desk, staring at the empty chair she'd left behind. The camera lingered on him. Even he looked momentarily shaken, but it passed quickly. He exhaled slowly, smoothed his tie, and turned to the audience. "Well," he began, his voice dry though softer than usual, "that was something." A ripple of uneasy laughter swept through the room. "To our viewers at home," he continued, "I apologize. We invite guests here to have real conversations, even heated ones. But at some point, when a guest refuses to engage in good faith and turns it into a shouting match, you have to draw the line." He straightened his posture and nodded to the camera. That line was tonight. The audience clapped softly, a mix of support and discomfort. Bill held up his hand to quiet them. "This is real time, not story time. You want a monologue? Start a podcast. You want a conversation? Sit down and talk. Meghan, wherever you are, good luck. Truly. But that kind of behavior doesn't fly here." He glanced at the crew off camera and motioned for the next guest to get ready. "We're going to take a quick break, folks," he said, his signature smirk returning, though fainter than usual. "When we come back, we'll talk about something a little less royal." The studio lights dimmed slightly as the show cut to commercial, but the buzz in the audience was electric, whispers flying as people tried to process what they just witnessed. On social media, clips were already going viral. Headlines were being written before Meghan even left the building. And in that moment, everyone watching knew they had just witnessed one of the most explosive live interviews in television history.